We're going to take a very close look today at one of Washington, D.C.'s most haunting and politically charged cold cases, the disappearance and eventual murder of Chandra Levy.
It's a case that really gets under your skin.
It does.
Yeah.
And our goal here is to try and cut through all the noise. I mean, the sensational headlines, the political intrigue that just completely define this tragedy, and really focus on the facts, the investigative errors, the media misdirection, and, well, the devastating failure of the justice system that left her case, to this day, officially unsolved.
It's just a terribly sad story of lost potential, but also a story of cascading errors. When you look at Chandra Levy, you see this young woman. She's only 24 years old.
Right.
And she was doing everything right. Born in Ohio, raised out in Modesto, California. She had a degree in journalism from San Francisco State. She was in D.C. for a paid master's internship at the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I mean, her whole life was right there in front of her.
And what makes the timing so heartbreaking is that she was literally about to start the next chapter. She had just finished her master's requirements. Her internship had been terminated in April 2001, but that was just because her academic eligibility was over. The plan was to go back to California in May for her graduation ceremony.
Exactly. She was last known to be active on May 1st, 2001. Her parents, they're back in Modesto. They can't reach her. And after 5 days, on May 6th, they call the police.
And what starts as, a local missing person report just explodes into this national obsession. D.C. became a media circus.
And then, a year later, the worst possible news.
Yes.
That initial chilling timeline really sets the stage for the chaos that followed. Disappeared May 1st, 2001. She's reported missing on May 6th, and then that grim discovery on May 22nd, 2002. Her skeletal remains are found in Rock Creek Park, which is about 4 miles from her apartment.
A full year.
A full year. So let's unpack those first critical days. When the Metropolitan Police Department, the MPD, they first go into her DuPont Circle apartment after her parents' call, what did they find? What signaled that this wasn't, someone who just decided to leave? Well, they get the warrant on May 10th to do a formal search, and the scene inside immediately points to some kind of abrupt interruption. Her credit cards, her ID, and critically, her mobile phone, they're all just left behind in her purse.
Everything you take with you.
Everything. And there are partially packed suitcases, which does suggest she was planning to move back to California soon, but not that day. Just didn't look like someone running away. And then they find the answering machine. It's full. And it includes 2 very specific messages from Congressman Gary Condit.
And right there, that's the moment the entire focus of the case just shifts. It moves away from finding a missing person to untangling this massive political scandal. But before we even get to Condit, there's a huge blunder right away that compromised the technical side of things.
A huge one. And it really speaks to, where we were in the early 2000s with digital forensics. A police sergeant goes in and tries to examine Levy's laptop right there in the apartment.
Not a tech guy.
Not a trained computer technician at all. And in the process of trying to look at it, he inadvertently corrupts the internet search data.
How bad was that error? I mean, in the grand scheme of things.
It was profoundly significant. First, it meant that computer experts had to spend a whole month, just painstakingly trying to reconstruct that corrupted data.
A month is an eternity in a missing person case.
It's everything. The first hours are the most critical. So this delay meant the only immediate digital clue to where she might have gone or what her intentions were was just gone for weeks. It forced investigators to rely on interviews and physical searches that were already, getting swallowed up by all the media attention.
So once they finally recovered that data, what kind of timeline did it paint for her last known moments on May 1st?
It gave them this sort of digital breadcrumb trail. It was part routine, part curiosity, and part really unsettling clue. She's searching for a mix of things. Amtrak, Southwest Airlines, so travel planning.
Right, that fits with her going home.
It fits. Then Baskin-Robbins, which could be anything, just a normal afternoon thought. And she also searched for the congressman, for Gary Condit. Her final known search at 12:59 p.m. was a seemingly random search for Alsace-Lorraine.
The region in France, that seems completely out of left field.
Exactly. Which just shows you how hard it is to interpret these digital clues. But one specific set of searches, around 11:33 in the morning, immediately grabbed their attention, especially once her body was found a year later.
What was it?
At 11:33 a.m., she searched for Rock Creek Park in the Washington Post Entertainment Guide. And then 1 minute later, at 11:34 a.m., she clicked a map link that was related to the park.
So on the day she vanished, shortly before noon, she's actively looking up the exact park where her remains would be found a year later.
Precisely. This led detectives to hypothesize she might have intended to meet someone in the park, maybe at the Pierce Klingle Mansion, which is the park headquarters. This was the only real piece of evidence pointing to her potential destination that day.
And now we have to turn to the figure who just completely hijacked the entire narrative, Congressman Gary Condit. He was married, a prominent Democrat, and he initially denied any romantic connection to this missing intern.
And that denial was the match that lit the whole fire. Condit represented California's 18th district. Ironically, it's the same area Chandra was from.
Wow.
And it was her father and her aunt who first told the police about the relationship. But here's a really critical insight into the psychology of that early chaos. Robert Levy, her father, he later admitted something painful. He said, and I'm quoting, "I just said whatever came to mind just to point to him as the villain because he suspected Condit was involved."
So that family suspicion, whether it was based on hard fact or just gut-wrenching fear, it's what immediately pushed this whole thing into the political spotlight. Condit's communication with the police was famously evasive. What did he actually tell them, and why did his behavior seem so suspicious to everyone?
When he finally did talk to them, he tried to really downplay their relationship. He described Livy as a vegetarian who didn't drink or smoke, almost like he was giving a character reference for an innocent young woman. He claimed he was surprised her apartment lease was up. But the real problem wasn't just his silence. It was his, strategic legalistic maneuvering. Condit, even though the MPD did clear him of direct involvement, became the poster child for political obstruction.
And I remember he had issues with another woman around that same time, which just added fuel to the fire.
Correct. The scrutiny wasn't just about Chandra Levy. He was separately investigated for possible obstruction of justice related to a flight attendant, Anne Marie Smith, who he was also having an affair with.
Unbelievable.
Smith claimed that Condit told her not to talk to the FBI about his personal life. Now, he wasn't charged with anything for that, but it added to this growing public narrative that Condit was this powerful man trying to hide something, no matter what it was.
And then there was the polygraph.
Yes. He refused to take a polygraph test from the D.C. police. To the public, that looks like an admission of guilt. His lawyer claimed he passed a private one, but refusing to cooperate with the official investigation was just a huge blow to his credibility.
But the real turning point, I think, for public opinion was in August 2001 when he finally did that disastrous televised interview.
Oh, his appearance with Connie Chung on ABC's Primetime Thursday was just a masterclass in how to fuel suspicion. He was noncommittal, he was evasive, he gave the public absolutely none of the emotional honesty they were looking for.
And the impact was immediate.
Immediate and measurable. Polls in July 2001 showed that a stunning 44% of Americans thought Condit was involved in her disappearance, and 51% believed he was acting like he was guilty. This media pressure just created this gravitational pull on the police, pulling resources and attention away from the park and straight toward the political angle.
It's really startling to think that this whole political saga only stopped because the country faced a tragedy of, an unimaginable scale.
That is the strange reality of that summer. The intensive media coverage, the Condit watch, it only stopped on the morning of September 11th. Reporters who'd been camped out in front of his apartment building, they left that morning and they never came back in those numbers.
But the political damage was done. It was irreversible.
Absolutely. The Levy controversy was permanently attached to his name. It was widely cited as a major reason he lost the Democratic primary for his congressional seat in March 2002. It effectively ended his career.
And even years later, when a murder trial finally happened, Condit was still dragged back into it.
He was subpoenaed to testify. In court, he maintained that personal boundary. He refused to confirm the sexual relationship on the stand, saying he wouldn't respond out of privacy for myself and Chandra.
But there was physical proof.
There was. The FBI provided the cold, hard science. Semen found on underwear in Levy's apartment contained sperm that matched Condit's DNA profile, so the affair was confirmed. But crucially, he was cleared of any involvement in her disappearance or her murder. The problem was the investigation had already wasted months, those critical early months, just focusing on the wrong person, all because of that media frenzy.
So the narrative shifts from this political distraction to a really grim discovery a year later, May 22nd, 2002. Can you walk us through how they found Chandra Levy's remains and what that told investigators right away?
This discovery was completely by accident. A man was walking his dog. He was actually off-trail looking for turtles, and he just stumbles upon the remains near a place called Broad Branch Creek in Rock Creek Park.
And the location?
It's about 4 miles from her apartment, deep inside the forested area. The remains were skeletal and scattered. They weren't buried. They were just lying on this steep wooded slope. And her personal items were nearby: a sports bra, a sweatshirt, leggings, tennis shoes.
The decomposition must have made it impossible to determine a cause of death for certain. What did the medical examiner conclude?
D.C. medical examiner Jonathan L. Arden declared the death a homicide. And while the remains were compromised, by a year of exposure and animal activity, Arden did note damage to the hyoid bone.
Which is in the neck, right?
It's a small U-shaped bone in the neck, and damage to it often suggests strangulation. But he had to admit it was inconclusive. So the official finding was homicide, but the specifics were lost to time. Arden's famous quote really sums it up. "It's possible we will never know specifically how she died."
And this brings us to what is, frankly, the most frustrating and profound error of the entire investigation, the failure to find her body during those initial intensive searches of the park. How did police miss a body just lying above ground for an entire year?
This was a systemic, almost a bureaucratic failure. And it came from a just catastrophic communication breakdown. Commanders at the MPD, they issued very specific, very clear search orders. Officers were supposed to conduct grid searches within 100 yards of every road and trail in Rock Creek Park. And this park is immense. The trails are numerous.
But that command didn't make it to the officers on the ground.
No, it did not. Because of a fatal miscommunication somewhere in the chain of command, the officers who were doing the actual physical search only searched within 100 yards of every road.
Not the trails.
They completely missed the official trails and all the dense, rugged areas right next to them. The spot where her remains were eventually found, that steep, wooded slope near the creek, it was accessible by a trail, but not by a road, and it fell completely outside the parameters the officers were mistakenly following. That one simple omission, failing to search the trails, left Chandra Levy undiscovered for a full 12 months.
And the fact that the family's own investigators found more evidence later just highlights how bad this oversight was.
It was so embarrassing and just deeply painful for the MPD. After the official police search, following the discovery, the private investigators hired by the Levy family went in. And they found Chandra's shin bone, along with some twisted wire, just 25 yards from the main cluster of remains.
After the police said they were done.
After the official recovery effort was over, and that discovery forced the police chief at the time, Charles H. Ramsey, to publicly admit the failure. He called the initial oversight unacceptable. It was just confirmation of negligence.
So while all the media was focused on Condit, there was another individual, someone who was actually committing assaults in that exact park at that exact time, who the police were told about very early on. Let's talk about Ingmar Guandique.
Guandique was an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador, and he already had this terrifying pattern of behavior in Rock Creek Park. He had been arrested for attacking 2 other women in the park right around the time Levy disappeared. And in September 2001, just a few months after she vanished, the police were officially told about his potential connection.
And that initial tip came from a jailhouse informant with a really dramatic but ultimately fabricated claim.
Yes. A jailhouse informant tells police that Guandique confessed that Congressman Condit paid him $25,000 to kill Levy. Now, investigators rightly dismissed the Condit payment part of that story. It was baseless. But the critical failure was that in dismissing the sensational political part, they also minimized the possibility that Guandique, a known predator in that exact location, could have been responsible for the murder itself.
He had already admitted to assaulting other women. What specific details about him, about his actions or his appearance, tied him to the timing of Levy's disappearance?
There were several details that pointed very strongly toward him. Guandique didn't show up for work on May 1st, the day Levy vanished. His former landlady also remembered that shortly after that day, his face looked scratched up and bruised.
Suggesting a struggle.
Right, that he had been in some kind of physical altercation. And his existing pattern of approaching and assaulting women in that specific part of the park made him a prime person of interest.
So, given all of this, the known predatory behavior, the circumstantial evidence, why didn't the MPD treat him as a prime suspect?
This is one of the biggest, most enduring questions of the whole investigation. Police Chief Ramsey at first only called him a person of interest. He didn't elevate him to a formal suspect. The Condit distraction was a huge factor, but there were also specific procedural failures. Critically, the investigators on the Levy case never interviewed the 2 women that Guandique had already attacked in Rock Creek Park.
And those victims could have provided crucial pattern evidence.
Exactly, evidence that would have directly linked him to the type of predatory encounter that Chandra Levy likely faced.
Did they do any kind of testing on him at the time?
They did. In February 2002, they gave him a polygraph test. Officially, the results were inconclusive, ruled not deceptive. But even the chief detective at the time, Jack Barrett, he had reservations. He said he would have preferred to have the test done by bilingual examiners who just weren't available. So this lack of certainty, combined with the continued focus on the political scandal, just allowed Guandique to slip through the cracks of the Levy case.
So he was just put away for the other assaults.
Right. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for the 2 other park attacks, and his connection to the Levy homicide was just seen as a satellite issue, not the central focus that it absolutely should have been.
So after all those early mistakes and the Condit media storm dies down, the case goes cold. We fast forward to 2006. What made the authorities decide to revisit the investigation?
A change in leadership at the MPD was crucial. The new D.C. police chief, Kathy L. Lanier, she recognized the failure of the first investigation. She assigned 3 veteran homicide investigators to the case, and they replaced the previous lead detective. They brought fresh eyes and a lot of much-needed experience to what was, by then, a 5-year-old murder.
And public pressure must have played a role in keeping the case alive.
Oh, eventually. The Washington Post published a major investigative series in 2008. They meticulously re-examined the police failure to fully investigate Guandique's connection to the park attacks. And that public pressure really provided the momentum and the institutional will to finally pursue a prosecution.
And this renewed focus finally turned up a small but physical link to Guandique.
Yes, years after he was in prison for his other crimes. In September 2008, investigators searched Guandique's federal prison cell in California, and they find a photo of Chandra Levy that he had saved from a magazine.
Suggesting an obsession.
Right, an obsessive interest in the victim or the crime. And that discovery, combined with new interviews with his acquaintances, finally led to formal charges.
8 years after she disappeared, an arrest is finally made.
On March 3, 2009, Ingmar Guandique was arrested and indicted on 6 counts, including first-degree murder during a kidnapping and first-degree murder during a sexual offense. The case was finally going to trial in 2010.
Let's get into that 2010 trial because it really relied heavily on pattern evidence and that highly volatile jailhouse testimony. How did the prosecution build a case when they had no murder weapon, no forensic DNA connecting Guandique to Levy's remains?
The prosecution's strategy was to establish Guandique's predatory pattern and his motive. They called the 2 women he had previously assaulted in Rock Creek Park Alley Schilling and Christy Wingand.
And their testimony must have been powerful.
Wigand's testimony was particularly powerful. She recounted being grabbed from behind, dragged down a ravine, and having a knife held to her face. This testimony established a terrifying and very specific modus operandi attacking lone women in that same dense wooded area. It directly linked him to the type of encounter Levy likely experienced.
But the central pillar, the absolute foundation of their entire argument, was the supposed confession.
Absolutely. They relied completely on a man named Armando Morales. Morales wasn't just another inmate. He was a self-proclaimed member of the MS-13 gang, and he had shared a cell with Guandique in Kentucky. Morales testified that Guandique confessed to him that he killed Levy while trying to rob her.
And the confession was detailed.
It was detailed enough to be convincing to a jury, but it had one very notable omission. Guandique explicitly denied raping Levy in the confession, and that led the prosecution to drop the sexual assault charge and the associated murder count during the trial.
A conviction based purely on jailhouse testimony, especially in a case this high profile, sounds precarious. What was the defense strategy from Samantha Sonnenberg, Guandique's attorney?
Sonnenberg just hammered away at the total lack of forensic evidence. She emphasized that after all the extensive testing, there was no DNA, no hair, no fiber, no physical evidence whatsoever linking Guandique to the crime scene, to Levy's remains, or her clothing. She called the prosecution's case fiction.
Did she offer an alternative theory?
She did. She argued it was plausible that Levy was murdered somewhere else, maybe inside her apartment, and that her body was dumped in the park later. And that theory, she argued, would explain the lack of physical evidence linking Guandique to the remains in the park.
Despite those arguments, the jury convicted Guandique in November 2010.
They did. He was found guilty of the 2 remaining counts of first-degree murder, one committed during a kidnapping and one during a robbery. A juror later confirmed that Armando Morales' testimony, that detailed confession, was the decisive factor. Guandique got a 60-year sentence. The judge called him a sexual predator, and Guandique maintained his innocence even at sentencing.
And this is where the integrity of the whole judicial process comes into question. The appeal focused entirely on the credibility of Armando Morales, and the foundation of that conviction starts its dramatic collapse.
The collapse was total. And it was devastating for the prosecutors. Years of appeals and confidential hearings all came to a head in 2015. The defense was able to demonstrate that Morales, the star witness, had lied under oath. He had committed perjury by denying he was a known jailhouse informant with a well-established reputation for being untrustworthy.
But this wasn't just about a witness lying. It was about the prosecution failing to provide information that would have exposed that lie. What exactly was withheld?
The defense revealed that the prosecuting attorneys, Fernando Campoamor Sanchez and Amanda Haynes, had failed to turn over what's known as exculpatory evidence, or giglio material. Specifically, they failed to provide the first page of a crucial memo detailing their contacts with Morales. Morales had testified at the trial that he had never cooperated with law enforcement before the Levy case.
So what did that missing first page reveal?
It was damning. That first page explicitly noted that Morales had in fact approached law enforcement before to discuss gang activity, including the actions of gangs he belonged to. This history suggested a pattern. Morales wasn't just some passive confidant who happened to hear a confession. He was an active informant with a known motivation to fabricate information to get favor, or reduce sentence, or better treatment.
So the implication is crystal clear. The prosecution had information that proved their star witness was a known fabricator, and they withheld it.
Precisely. The defense attorneys argued that the prosecution deliberately suppressed this information because it would have completely destroyed Morales' credibility with the jury. Judge Gerald Fisher agreed. He recognized the constitutional violation, and he granted the motion for a new trial in June of 2015.
And the final nail in the coffin came a year later, which sealed the collapse of the entire case against Guandique.
By July 2016, the prosecution formally announced they would not proceed with the case. They had no confidence. They had learned that Morales had been secretly recorded admitting to lying on the witness stand during the 2010 trial.
Definitive proof.
Definitive proof of perjury. Without their key witness, and with the rest of the evidence being purely circumstantial, no DNA, the U.S. Attorney's Office conceded they just didn't have enough evidence to secure a conviction in a retrial.
So Guandique's conviction was vacated, his murder charges were dropped, and he was deported to El Salvador in May 2017.
And that is how, 16 years after her disappearance, Chandra Levy's murder remains officially unsolved. The man convicted of the crime was set free, not because he was proven innocent, but because the judicial process that convicted him was corrupted by misconduct.
This whole tragic case offers just profound lessons about the intersection of media, politics, and justice. The intensity of the coverage in 2001 was just, unprecedented. 63% of Americans were following the case closely that summer.
The media acted as a massive echo chamber, and critics widely condemned the press for what they call pack journalism and a rush to judgment in just portraying Congressman Guandique as the likely killer. This disproportionate focus on the politician became the story, and it often overshadowed the actual investigative work that was needed in Rock Creek Park.
And there was a necessary and very sobering reflection on which cases get this level of national attention.
That's a crucial point. A Washington Post reporter, Robert Pierre, he pointed out the excessive media focus on Chandra Levy as a glamorous white murder victim. And this focus stood in stark contrast to the almost 200 other homicides in D.C. that year, most of which involved black victims and received almost no national coverage. It just highlights a painful disparity in how victims are valued by the national press.
There's also an interesting distinction in how the media treated the two main people of interest, Condi and Guandique.
Yes, the conservative commentator Michelle Malkin highlighted what she called a glaring omission in the early reporting on Ingmar Guandique. She reviewed numerous news reports and found that the press consistently omitted any mention of his status as a criminal illegal alien or the fact that his application for temporary protected status had been denied after he had already assaulted those two other women in the park.
Why do you think that specific detail was so often suppressed or minimized in the mainstream reporting?
Well, in the charged political atmosphere that the Guandique scandal created, the media just seemed to focus solely on that high-profile political connection. Addressing Guandique's immigration status would have introduced a whole other layer of complexity and maybe a different kind of political charge that just didn't fit the initial sensationalized narrative of the missing intern and the powerful congressman. It wasn't the headline people were consuming.
After Guandique was convicted in 2010, Gary Conditt's legal team issued a really powerful statement that just captured the lasting personal cost of that media frenzy.
Bert Fields, Condit's lawyer, he called the conviction a complete vindication, but his follow-up comment really resonated. He said, "That comes a little late. Who gives him his career back?" Condi was just permanently damaged by the spectacle. He was forced to retire from politics and move away from Washington.
The collapse of the Guandique conviction was followed by pretty significant professional consequences for the prosecutors involved.
Indeed. Guandique's defense attorneys immediately filed a formal complaint with the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility, or OPR. They alleged that the prosecutors, Fernando Campoamor Sanchez and Amanda Haynes, had deliberately withheld that critical first page of the Armando Morales memo.
What was the initial finding from the OPR, and how did that differ from what the D.C. Bar did later?
Well, OPR investigated for 2 years and initially found no ethical or legal violations. They suggested the prosecutors had acted in good faith. But the D.C. Bar's Office of Disciplinary Counsel, the ODC, which oversees attorney ethics in the district, later brought formal charges. And this just highlights the different standards that are applied by an internal Justice Department review versus an external ethics body.
What were the specific defenses from the two prosecutors? They denied any wrongdoing.
Both maintained they hadn't deliberately committed misconduct. Haynes, in particular, testified that she believed the full memo had been turned over to the defense and suggested that maybe the defense had just lost that crucial first page. She also raised a very unusual but serious defense based on her experience. She said that she sometimes delayed turning over detailed information on witnesses because, in past trials, the early disclosure of a witness's identity had led to those witnesses being killed or intimidated.
That raises an immediate tension between the legal requirement for disclosure, the Brady and Giglio obligations, and the real-world danger that witnesses can face.
It absolutely does. The ethical requirement is non-negotiable. Prosecutors must disclose all potentially exculpatory evidence. But Haynes' defense, it speaks to the inherent risks of working gang-related cases in D.C. However, the ODC's preliminary conclusion was clear. Both attorneys violated the rules, regardless of their intent or any mitigating factors.
And what was the punishment that the ODC ultimately recommended?
The ODC recommended a 6-month suspension from practicing law for both Campoamor Sanchez and Haynes. Their attorneys, of course, contested this vigorously. They called the punishment unhinged and maintained their clients acted ethically. This disciplinary fallout just cemented the fact that the collapse of the Guandique case wasn't just about an unreliable witness, it was about the fundamental integrity of the prosecutorial process itself.
Despite the catastrophic errors and the judicial failures, Chandra Levy's tragic case did spur some important, lasting changes in advocacy and legislation for missing young adults.
That is the one enduring positive legacy. Levy's disappearance, along with other high-profile cases, it highlighted a critical gap in resources for families. Her parents quickly used groups like the Carole Son Carrington Memorial Reward Foundation, which was a nonprofit established after 3 other women disappeared in 1999.
And this advocacy helped solidify federal resources specifically for adults who had been, previously overlooked.
Exactly. The foundational work for this really came from the earlier 1997 case of Kristen Modafferi. Her parents found they couldn't get help from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children because Kristen was 18. Their work led Congress to enact Kristen's Law in October of 2000, and this law officially established the National Center for Missing Adults, the NCMA, within the Department of Justice to coordinate cases for missing people over 18.
So by the time Chandra Levy disappeared in 2001, these institutions were in place.
They were in place to offer the technical support and coordination her family so desperately needed.
And Chandra's mother, Susan Levy, she channeled her devastating experience into continued support for other families.
She became a tireless advocate. Susan Levy co-founded Wings of Protection, which is a support group for families with missing loved ones. And it's really poignant to note that she had actually been involved in efforts to find another missing woman from Modesto, Lacey Peterson, before her own daughter disappeared. Susan Levy received an award in May 2002 for her advocacy with Wings of Protection, just demonstrating that human capacity to create some good from unimaginable grief.
So when we synthesize all the source material on the Chandra Levy case, what really emerges is this painful portrait of a system under pressure, a system defined by a cascade of sequential failures. Her life, just so full of promise, was brutally cut short right as she was preparing for a new chapter.
And that initial phase was defined entirely by misdirection. The media's intense, disproportionate focus on Gary Condit, fueled by the political scandal and his own evasiveness, it just consumed all the investigative attention. It diverted resources away from the critical physical search of Rock Creek Park. And ultimately, the attempt to secure justice failed.
Yeah.
The conviction of Ingmar Guandique collapsed because the prosecution relied fatally on a compromised jailhouse informant, Armando Morales, who committed perjury. And that failure was compounded by the prosecutor's own ethical and legal violation of withholding exculpatory evidence, which invalidated the entire trial process. The case today remains officially unsolved.
Which leads us to the final critical question that we want you, our listener, to consider. The former chief detective, Jack Barrett, looking back on this, he noted that the media coverage placed enormous amounts of pressure on the Washington, D.C. police and prosecutors to deliver a conviction in this very public, very political case. So when investigators are under that kind of immense pressure, how does the demand for a rapid resolution or a high-profile suspect affect the integrity of the investigation itself, particularly when it pushes the system toward relying on unreliable testimony and rationalizing errors in evidence disclosure?
It forces us to ask whether the political environment of a case can fundamentally compromise the pursuit of impartial justice for the victim.
Thank you for joining us for this in-depth exploration of the source material.
Thanks for listening.